Fred Krupp is the president of the Environmental Defense Fund, a position he's held for 25, 27 years. And most recently has served on the advisory board for the Secretary of Energy exploring natural gas. So we'll explore what he explored with this advisory board. On the advisory board, Fred was the only person who was not directly tied to the natural gas industry. So he had a really keen point of observation. I want to begin, though, with the note that Stanford University convened kind of a day-long session on natural gas, perhaps even longer than a day. Just 10 days ago, Fred was not there, I wasn't either, but they issued a press release kind of announcing what they had covered. And the first line was that abundant domestic natural gas resources are a blessing for U.S. energy policy, or a curse, depending on your perspective. Thank you, Stanford. Fred, where do we come down on this?
Well, America has a tremendous amount of natural gas. The estimates of how much we have doubled over just the past few years, from 1,000 trillion cubic feet to 2,000 trillion cubic feet. We use about 24 trillion cubic feet a year, which means we have 80 years of supply. There's no doubt in my mind that America is going to use the gas. So the question is, what do we use it for, and how do we get the rules right so it's used well?
This advisory board for the Department of Energy came about, what, about a year ago?
A little over a year ago, the President asked Secretary Chu to impanel 7 of us to chart a safe path for developing shale. The shale resource is where a lot of the natural gas is being extracted from.
Explain just for a moment, if you can, the kind of the nature of shale gas and what happens when you try to extract it, when you go after it.
Well, it's a very industrialized process, and there are a lot of environmental implications of doing it. No one should gloss over that. Basically, most of the shale is found in deep formations, a mile deep, 5,000 feet under the surface or more. You drill a well vertically, and then you go horizontally for maybe a mile out horizontally. After you case the well, then you begin to fracture the shale. And what they do is they have things that look like torpedoes about this long that get put down the vertical shaft and then go around the corner. And every few feet, explosives go off, and they create 30 to 36-inch long fractures in the shale. After that step, they pump a lot of water with chemical additives and sand into that shale, and the fractures expand for as long as they keep pumping the water in, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet or more. And the sand stays in those fractures. They have a technical word for it. They call it a proppant. What that means is it props the fractures open, and that allows the gas to be pulled out when the well is pumped. When the water goes in, it might be 5 million gallons of water for a well. It's a lot. And then the water is taken out, about 1 million gallons comes out. The water that gets taken out not only has the chemicals that were added, but it has the chemicals from the Earth's geology in it, which sometimes can include radionuclides, tremendous amounts of brine, things you would not want to drink, things that need to be dealt with safely, or you have a big problem.
We'll return to this kind of the question of fracking, but I want to also ask you about this process that you go through if you're appointed to this advisory board. Who else is on the board, and what is it that you all do to try to answer this question that the President has? How do you go about using this resource safely and wisely over the next decades?
The board had some some people on it that I have great respect for. John Deutsch was the former head of our Central Intelligence Agency. There were 2 professors on it, Mark Zoback from Stanford, geologist, Steve Holditch from Texas A&M, Katie McGinty, an environmentalist who was the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of Pennsylvania, also President Clinton's environmental advisor, Sue Tierney, had been an Energy Department official, both nationally and in the state of Massachusetts, and Dan Yergin from CIRA, the consultancy on energy. Those were the other 6. And basically, Alex, I had to learn, we all had to learn a lot, maybe I more than the others, and I just asked my team at EDF, who had been working on this issue for a while, to give me some documents. They gave me 11, and I said, after I finished those, that I wanted more. Bad mistake. They gave me about 65 more documents totaling hundreds of thousands of pages. They gave me digests too, but I read an enormous amount and came to understand that, one, the environmental implications of natural gas extraction, including fracking shale, are real. 2, that they're largely not being addressed properly. Industry is in denial. They keep hiding behind the idea that the fractures aren't causing water contamination. That ignores the fact that we have hundreds of documented cases of water contamination, maybe not from the fractures, but from surface water spills and from failures of the well casing. And that denial and hiding behind this one statement has caused industry to have a big public trust problem. But my third conclusion is that there is a path forward. So that's what the process I went through, was to study up and then meet with people in the communities that are being impacted, in many cases harmed, by the activity, and learn all I could from them too.
What did this board actually come up with a set of written conclusions, and here's our advice from the advisory board?
We did. One of the things I did in the process was consult my colleagues and other environmental groups that had both concerns and also suggestions. I compiled those suggestions. I wasn't sure what would happen in this process, and somewhat to my surprise, this good group of folks adopted really the vast majority of the suggestions that I made, that Katie McGinty made, that Sue Tierney made, Mark Zoback, the others, recommendations
that came from the conservation community.
That came from the conservation community. But I have to say, going into the process, Alex, I mean, at the very first meeting, I shared with the group my nightmare, which, as you can imagine, was that we would be issuing a report to the Secretary of Energy, that the Secretary of Energy has no regulatory power over these issues, and that the report would be used as a cover for saying that, you know, in some alternate universe, shale gas fracking could be done well, while in the real world it wouldn't be. That was my nightmare, and I shared that nightmare. But by last August, the report ended up having a whole series of recommendations to deal with the 5 sets of issues: the air pollution, conventional air pollution, the emissions from these wells are a big cause of smog. There's other health effects from the emissions. The methane emissions, which is a potent greenhouse gas, as was discussed earlier this morning. The water issues, both the water coming out of the well as well as the water you put in the well. The waste that come out of the drill bits, what do you do with that? Where do you get the water from? If you're taking 5 million gallons out of the Hudson River, that's one thing. If you're taking it out of a trout stream here in Colorado, that's a horse of a different color. The effects on forest fragmentation, the community impacts. We had recommendations for all of those issues, and pretty good recommendations. And then maybe even better, Alex, our second and final report last fall put a spotlight on the need for those recommendations to be adopted. So just because we wrote a report saying that this could be done right doesn't mean it will be. unless the country, individual states, companies, the federal government, all actually change what's happening on the ground.
This natural gas is so, well, hundreds of thousands of pages in these documents that, thank God you didn't have to read all of, but you were telling me yesterday about one detail that I thought was a really a good insight into just how careful you have to be in this process and how complicated something like extracting this gas is. It was this kind of the idea of methane leaks at these sites and how that dramatically affects the amount of, and the goal of all this is that you will reduce your carbon emissions because you will substitute natural gas for coal, and measuring that equation, this issue of methane leak at the site of a well turns out to be a very key component.
Well, what I learned, Alex, is that no one has measured the methane leaks in a long time. EPA, the last time they took an inventory was in 1997, before there was any significant amount of shale fracking going on. And so what difference does it make if 1% of the methane, another word for natural gas, what difference does it make if 1% of the methane leaks into the atmosphere, or 6 or 7 or 8%? Doesn't sound like much. How much could that affect America's total footprint on the world's climate? Well, what if I told you the answer to that question is, if we have a leak rate of, say, 6%, which is double the EPA's estimate, but we don't know whether the EPA's estimate is high or low. If the leak rate currently is 6% of the product leaking from the wells, or from the transport pipes, or from the transmission pipes, it could account for as much as 1/4 of the nation's total emissions in terms of our climate-forcing impact on the atmosphere over the next few decades. Whereas if the leak rate was just 1% of the product going into the atmosphere before it's burned, then it would be much smaller. Or put in other words, whether EPA is right or it's much higher, we get a lot of climate benefit out of natural gas only if we can reduce the leak rate of methane to 1% or less. The break-even point, if you're substituting for coal, is about 3%. The break-even point, if you're substituting for diesel fuel in long-haul trucks, is 1%. And when I say break-even point, I mean in terms of the impact on the climate in all time frames. So my view is we need to protect the local citizens from the impacts that are local, and we also need to protect the atmosphere. But America is using a lot of gas and is going to use more.
The EPA current estimate for methane leak, perhaps not, the data looks a little sketchy perhaps, it's 2.5%, which is awfully close to that 3% break-even point of you might as well keep burning coal.
Yes, but in Colorado, NOAA took some measurements in 2009, and they found in the production fields alone, not counting the leaks from the pipes, and when it gets into the cities, a leak rate in the Denver-Julesburg area of 4%. So we now are working with the University of Texas and several other partners in industry who've given us permission to measure leaks on their land to actually nail this and find out what the leak rate is.
The Environmental Defense Fund has said your group does think that it's worth trying to explore extracting this natural gas because there is a potential serious gain in terms of carbon emissions.
Well, I wouldn't say it matters what we think. In the terms of the environmental community's thoughts about natural gas, certainly Environmental Defense Fund's thoughts, I don't think are going to affect how much we use. Right now, natural gas is being used. The benefits are obvious to national security, to lowering electricity rates for people. And so it's not as though, I actually think as we retire coal plants, We need to do what David Orr suggested this morning from this stage, maximize the amount of efficiency gains we make in this country. There's a tremendous amount of efficiency that we can use instead of electricity. We need to maximize the amount of solar power and wind power. We need to modernize our grid to allow those intermittent sources used. I would like to minimize the amount of natural gas personally, and EDF would, that is substituted for coal. Having said that, I also live in the real world, and in the real world from June until this spring, we've reduced the amount of coal we're burning in this country, some because some coal plants are shuttering permanently, others because some coal plants are being dispatched less than natural gas. They could be turned on in a few months. But the share of coal-fired electrons has gone from 51% a few years ago, 45% 6 or 8 months ago, to in the high 30s. 75% of that coal has been replaced by natural gas. So that's in the real world, that's happening. While we should do everything we can to promote distributed generation and renewables, we also have to make sure that we get the rules governing natural gas right. And when I put the emphasis on the word rules and shout it out a little louder, it's got to be laws. The idea that industry best practices are going to work is hooey. And the reason it's bull is because 50% of the natural gas in this country is produced by the top 40 producers. To see where 75% of the natural gas in this country is produced, you have to go to the top 300 producers. And to get all the natural gas that we produce onshore in this country, you have to get to a few thousand producers. So yes, there may be some, and there are some natural gas companies that are operating responsibly, but to protect all the neighbors, as well as to deal with the methane leak rate, we need laws and we need systems that force compliance, which not only means the states need to have lots of inspectors, the penalties need to be onerous if there's violators, but we need systems, in my view, like we have under the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, the sulfur provisions, are complied with 100% because the companies certify that these are their emissions, and if they falsify that certification, it's a felony. And when you have such a distributed system as natural gas production in this country, no matter how many inspectors you have, I think you have to have the companies in an auditable way have their own reputation, certifying that they're doing it right, in addition to having adequate inspection capacity.
Even so, the idea that you're going to get thousands of these extraction companies to follow all these proper procedures in every case, which is you don't want to be polluting aquifers that we all share, is impossible for some people to accept that this is going to happen. There's a woman named Sandra Steingraber, who's a PhD biologist, writer, cancer survivor. She's written about pollutants and carcinogens a lot. She's undertaking an anti-fracking campaign in New York, saying this is a bridge to the wrong place. It just can't be done safely. And she specifically has criticized EDF, because when an organization like EDF EDF was founded back in the late 60s. It filed the first lawsuits that forced local governments and then state governments to stop using DDT. It pioneered the use of the courts to try to make environmental regulation safe for all. It's got a very distinguished history. And she says, you're putting that distinguished history behind fracking, and that is wrong.
Well, first of all, the concerns about fracking and natural gas development are very real, and I can understand her perspective. When I visited Washington County in Pennsylvania, where fracking got way ahead of the state rules, our commission, myself and the other 6, were told by a woman who was living out of her car that she had been forced out by the air emissions and the fumes. Her children were living with relatives. So I think the concerns are legitimate. The question is, what's the right position? Some places should not have natural gas drilling. There have to be places set aside, and we can debate what those places should be. But in some places, the shale formations are too close to the aquifers. In some places, you want to preserve pristine natural beauty, for sure. In other places, shale gas is being produced today. In Louisiana, in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Ohio, in Indiana, the idea that somehow we are going to stop this from happening, I think is not in the real world. In the real world, people are suffering today, and the longer we delay getting the rules right, the more damage is going to happen. So I think while, yes, we need to campaign to set aside some places, we also need to get the rules right. And if we ignore that part of the equation, there is a downside of fracking that will continue.
I'm going to open this up to questions from everybody, but one last question for you. You've gone through this advisory board experience. The Bureau of Land Management, which manages all the federal lands where this gas and oil will be developed, is right now in a rule-making procedure to write its rules, to say this is how fracking should be done. What's the most important thing for the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management to get right?
Well, the Department of Interior, the new rules are, a step. I think they need to be way more aggressive. The Department of Interior could be setting a model for the states of how to do this right, but right now they're not. The new rules don't deal with air emissions. They are not comprehensive on disclosure. While it's a step in the right direction in a sense, and the EPA rules on air emissions cover about 8% of the emissions, that's good. We need to do a lot more than the Obama administration has done, or the federal government is likely to do. Right now, 14 states is where 85% of onshore natural gas is drilled. Those 14 states, some of them have good regulations on some issues. They all need to be improved. There's 5 categories of issues that I outlined before. I think to get the rules right means here in Colorado, in Wyoming, and in these other states, we need to get strong rules in place, and that is going to be the quickest path to protecting the environment and people who live near these sites.
Okay. We'll ask you to, let's start right here, but we'll ask you to wait for a microphone and identify yourself before you ask a question, okay?
My name is Jeff Crane.
That mic isn't live. Try it again. No?
You know what? I don't really need a microphone.
Stand up and yell.
My name is Jeff Crane. I'm with the Colorado Watershed Assembly. We are a coalition of local citizen groups in Colorado, and I'm wondering what you see as the role of citizen volunteer organizations throughout the country with water quality monitoring and air quality monitoring, what they could do, what citizen groups can do across this country, given the technology that we have today, it's very complicated. It's also secretive, proprietary information. What can citizen
Let
groups
Fred
do?
answer that. Would you just say again who you are and what you represent?
My name is Jeff Crane. I'm director of the Colorado Watershed Assembly, and it is a coalition of local citizen groups, watershed groups throughout the state.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. It's a great question. First of all, part of the getting the rules right means that the company should have to disclose the identities of the chemicals, the quantity of the chemicals that are going down the hole. But more than that, they should have to disclose when the return water and the produced water comes out, what is the chemical composition of that. They should have to disclose where the water is coming from and where it goes and how it's treated and to what standard. They should have to disclose the air emissions. These are not my opinions. These were the opinions of these are my opinions, but in addition to being my opinions, they're the opinions of the Secretary of Energy's advisory board. We came out for a very broad set of mandated disclosure, because if we wait till companies do it voluntarily, we'll be waiting for a long time. The good news is we're moving to a world of ubiquitous data and low-cost sensing devices. And we need citizen groups to be encouraged and to do monitoring. Methane monitors are becoming less and less expensive. We are doing a project in the Environmental Defense Fund now to monitor where the leaks are and to calibrate some of the low-cost devices that would be affordable by citizens groups with some of the more precise and expensive devices. And I think over the next year you will see a lot more citizens actually monitoring themselves, but not to be a substitute for the need for the states to mandate the companies to monitor themselves and disclose the information. The last thing I'll say is that for the role of citizen groups is I think communities should have a choice. I don't think that we should have the states or the federal government preempting the ability of a county or municipality to drill or not drill. If companies can make it safe enough that they can convince the community that they will be welcome neighbors, that's a pretty good standard to hold them to. And this is what Governor Cuomo, apparently it's been reported, his plan in New York, where there's been a moratorium, he plans to lift that and allow counties that want to opt in to do so. Now, I can't endorse his plan because I haven't seen the details, and we are concerned that the regulations there, the drafts we've seen, are inadequate so far. But the idea that instead of preempting counties, counties should be empowered to determine their own future, I think that's a good principle.
My name is Cindy Hubin, and I'm the Community Development Director for this county, Pitkin County. And I can tell you right now, we don't have the local controls. We're not allowed to through the state and how it works today. So my question of you is, how are you trying to influence the state through your committee's work? How are you trying to influence states individually, and what are you specifically doing with Colorado at this point?
Well, the Environmental Defense Fund is lucky enough to have an office in Boulder, and we have been very active on natural gas issues in Colorado. We are working to try to get a better set of regulations here. We've been working with Governor Hickenlooper and others. When the state of Colorado improved its disclosure regulations, we were very much part of that mix, along with the Sierra Club and other environmental groups. But the rules in Colorado, when Governor Ritter, who's here with us this weekend, while they were the best in the country when adopted in 2008, now we know more, and they need to be further strengthened in a whole variety of ways. And I understand the situation in Colorado where the communities do not yet have the right to determine their future, and we favor that. So we are working in that direction.
This gentleman over here. Yes, sir.
Mr. Fialka.
Thank you. My name is John Fialka. I'm the editor of a newsletter called Climate Wire. And I was struck by what you said about this forthcoming investigation or test in Texas to determine the CO2 emissions from a shale field, which seems to me like a very big measurement problem. Are you suggesting, number one, that we don't really have a protocol that we can rely on to use in other places, and that's what you're developing? I mean, how long will it take for an accurate measurement system that works in other places to be developed, and then translate that into what you want to do, Fred, which is to have a law? And I assume that's a federal law.
Well, first of all, we know enough about methane leaks now to know that they need to be closed. We don't have to wait for any more studies to know that wherever we find leaks, we should be closing them, and that the regulations should be stricter. Second of all, we absolutely need data. So at the same time as we're closing leaks, we need to be developing data. The Environmental Defense Fund is working with the University of Texas and with other partners, and we have agreed on a protocol to go out into the field and measure. And how long will it take? I'm hoping by the end of this calendar year, those measurements, which have already started, will be done. NOAA is also independently taking measurements, so that data is beginning to come in. We also need, though, to measure, in addition to the production fields, the leaks that come from the transportation pipes, as well as the smaller distribution pipes under cities, as well as from the gathering lines and the processing. The good news, John, is that while this is underway, and I think all of those studies can be completed within a couple of years, the availability of low-cost sensing technology to empower any group to also detect ambient quantities of methane is moving along quite fast. So I think this is going to be a very democratized issue. Data will be widely available, and there will be enormous incentives not only to have laws, which I think I'd welcome then at the federal level. I don't want to wait, and we're pushing the federal government to do this, but I think we have to push the states too. Colorado and Wyoming have the best air quality rules from natural gas extraction. They too need to be strengthened. We've got to do all of this. It is methane emissions, not CO2 emissions we're looking for.
This gentleman back here, go ahead. It's you and that, yes.
Scott Cassell, the Product Stewardship Institute. Who do you consider your biggest allies in building a coalition in support of your recommendations, and what would you say are your biggest barriers to success?
I think we're, frankly, Scott, too early in the process to know who our biggest allies are. Certainly, I was happy to have the colleagues on the commission take, I thought, a very strong and good stance. I believe there are companies that use natural gas, that, as well as companies that produce natural gas, who understand that their license to operate is in jeopardy because of the erosion of public trust. So my hope is that we will see companies begin to come forward and say that the bar needs to be raised in a mandatory legal way. We've seen a little bit of that. In Colorado, Shale supported the stronger disclosure law that was adopted in Colorado. Not as strong as we would like, but stronger than the alternatives. We've seen Governor Kasich, the Republican governor in Ohio, adopt many of the agreements that EDF and Southwestern Energy, a natural gas company, came to about the casings of wells. This is where a lot of the aquifers have been polluted, when the casings that go from the surface down through the aquifer, when that casing fails, this is where we've seen contamination of some aquifers, hundreds actually, as well as spills of chemicals on the surface is the other source of contamination of aquifers. Southwestern agreed with us on what a model law would look like, and the governor of Ohio has been advancing pretty good standards in that state. Unfortunately, others in industry say when the governor of Ohio put together a bill that would have required disclosure of a lot of the things I mentioned before should be disclosed, the industry association weakened that in the Ohio state legislature. So we've got to get to a point where the business community doesn't just say they want strong rules in general, but where they're actually helping to adopt them in specific states. And I can't say we are there yet.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, Fred. In terms of allies and opposition on this issue of fracking, what is your concern about a split developing in the green community over fracking?
Well, I think I agree with my colleagues in the green community that there's some places where we just shouldn't be drilling. I am concerned if we don't pay enough attention to getting the rules right, then I do not believe there will be a national moratorium either on new drilling nor on all the thousands, tens of thousands of existing wells. So I hope enough of our collective energy in the environmental community goes to getting the new rules right. But there are a lot of groups EDF is working with at the state level and at the national level as well that understand this and are our allies too in getting the rules right. So I think we'll have to see. We are in close communication with each other, and we all understand that a split developing is not in anybody's interest.
Okay. Here, this gentleman back here.
Larry Berliner, I'm University of Denver, Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. We're talking about the future of natural gas. We have a company in Golden, Colorado called Luca Technologies, and I don't know if people are aware of it, that are going to old wells and putting down the nutrients for the bacteria that are in those holes to produce more natural gas. They've had a few setbacks recently with arguments with BLM, et cetera, and I actually have an article from last Sunday's Denver Post on that. And I'm just curious if EDF's aware of this or any sort of comments on this. I'm really passionate about it. I think their ideas are phenomenal, and they're a startup company. I wish I could go around with a hat to help them get more money to get them going. So
I'm not personally familiar with it. It may be that the experts on our team, Scott Anderson, Matt Watson, others are, but I'd welcome you to send me more information. Yeah, my email is just fred@edf.org, so I'm pretty accessible.
And out here, you, sir, back there in the white shirt.
Thanks. Jim Kunstler from upstate New York. I wonder whether the fracking issue is to some extent a distraction from questions about the whole economic model of fracking. And in particular, the way that you arrived at your information and the way it's been spread back out to the public, which I would regard as a disinformation campaign. The EIA, which is the Department of Energy's own energy information agency, has been notably unreliable over the years in their reporting of what the resources really are, largely because they depend on the industry figures themselves for their reports. But it did happen that in the last 12 months they revised their estimate of available shale gas resources by 60%. Independent oil analyst Arthur Berman and independent oil and gas analyst Dave Powers have both come to the conclusion, which they've published, that we have in fact probably not more than 5 or 6 or 7 years of shale gas resources. And finally, I don't see how you can, in good conscience, go to Daniel Yergin, the chief public relations agent for the oil industry, to get reliable information about oil or gas. And for Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy, to allow Barack Obama to get up in front of the American people and say we have 100 years of shale gas is a crime and a terrible act of
Let's let
disinformation.
Fred respond to that. Thank you.
So how could you possibly allow that to happen? This represents the erosion of authority in America at the highest levels.
The shale gas estimates have been as high as 3,000 trillion cubic feet. The consensus now is that there's 2,000 trillion cubic feet. That's not just the Department of Energy, that's a lot of independent academic experts. I would bet my house that we have more than 7 years supply of shale gas, if you'd like to take the bet. In my role, I tried to get information from every source, including citizens, environmental groups, meeting with people. I don't know what more I can say.
Yes, Miss back there.
My name is Nancy Grolke, a research scientist for the Forest Service. Has the cost of cleaning the water been considered in the carbon footprint?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. The costs overall, by the way, I should say, the International Energy Agency estimated the costs of doing this right are about 7% higher than the current costs. But your question, how much energy will be necessary to run reverse osmosis or otherwise clean the water, I'll have to look into that. It's an excellent question.
Yes, in back there. You can just pass that microphone.
David Smith from Plano, Texas, near one of the current fracking frontiers. But my question is in regard to the economics of gas production and gas use. You know, the market has set the price of gas relatively low. That could be a disincentive for better industry practices or complying with new regulations. Also, we have the problem in Texas is that there's a disincentive to build new gas-fired power plants. You know, we may be short of electricity in our state within a few years.
I'm not sure I heard the question, but
That's basically the economics. I think generally we've let the market set the pricing, and you know that creates some disincentives.
There is the Energy Information Administration analyst I spoke to last December said the price of natural gas now is so low, it's a near disruptive market force. So it's much harder to develop renewables because natural gas is so cheap.
yeah, it's been a game changer, there's no question about it. And the thing everyone needs to understand about natural gas is unlike oil that can be shipped around the world, natural gas can't be. You can if you compress it and liquefy it, but there's so much energy and so much cost, billions of dollars in building a liquefaction plant. That is why the price of natural gas in the United States is $2.50, whereas in Japan it's $17. So there's one export plant that's been licensed, but it's probably a good bet that the price will stay much lower than it was, maybe not at $2, but maybe $4 or $5 for, in my view, the short term. You know, I believe we should have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. There should be a price on carbon. That should include all the methane emissions, and the methane is incredibly powerful greenhouse gas, so that's got to be calculated. I believe we should be doing everything we can with our public utility commissions in Texas and in all the other states to make sure we are dispatching more wind, more renewables, and especially allowing energy efficiency to compete. You know, in the summer, when we have these peak spikes in electricity demand, modern technology can move those spikes in demand to the evening or to other times of day, or cut that demand just through energy efficiency. But right now, the PUC rules don't allow the modern innovators who can make that happen to sell those saved electrons into the grid, except in some jurisdictions. So this is beginning to change. This is something we should be joining together to do in all the states. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I just would say in Texas, the air quality implications of natural gas are particularly big. In the Dallas Fort Worth area, 4 million cars and trucks drive around, and they produce ozone precursors, turn into smog. The natural gas operations in the area, according to a study from SMU, produce about the same amount of natural gas precursors. So the air pollution side, which has received a lot less attention, deserves a lot more attention, and we've got to fix it.
Fred, thank you.
Thank you.